This is Beyond the Business.
We are used to check the weather. Temperature, wind, rain. We know it can change during the day. We expect variability. We plan around it. But there is another layer that we almost never treat in the same way: air quality. It is not something most people check in the morning. It is not something we usually plan around. And for a long time, we did not need to. Because the assumption was simple: air would gradually improve with cleaner energy, stricter regulations, and technological progress. It would move in a predictable direction toward cleaner conditions. But what if air should be understood in the same way as weather? Not as something that steadily improves, but as something that changes, fluctuates, and responds to multiple forces at the same time. Because air is not a single system, it sits at the intersection of energy, industry, transport, climate, and policy. And when all of those systems begin to shift, air does not follow a straight line. It reacts. Over the past few years, we have already seen signs of this. Wildfire smoke reaching regions that had never experienced it before, heat waves increasing ozone levels, urban air improving in some places while deteriorating in others. This is not a temporary anomaly. It is a pattern, and it changes the question. And the question is no longer, will air quality improve? The question becomes, what will the air look like? And how predictable will it be? Because the answer depends on more than one system. It depends on science, on economics, on policy, and on what people are already experiencing. And when those layers are combined, the forecast becomes more complex. Not a straight line, but a range of outcomes, more uneven and less predictable. If we step into how the scientific community is actually modeling the atmosphere today, the starting point is no longer neutral. And this is where most public discussions already fall behind reality. The baseline used across Earth system science is the Planetary Boundaries Framework, developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center under the leadership of Johan Rockström. According to the latest consolidated assessments, 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries are already exceeded, which means the Earth system is no longer operating within the stable range that defined the last several thousand years. Air is not treated as a standalone boundary in this framework, and that is critical for understanding any forecast. It sits across climate change, atmospheric aerosol loading, and chemical pollution, which means it is not controlled by a single variable. It reflects the combined state of multiple systems that are already outside their stable range. Once those systems move beyond their thresholds, responses become nonlinear, meaning changes are no longer gradual or proportional. The atmospheric baseline itself confirms these shifts. The safe level of carbon dioxide is defined at approximately 350 parts per million, while current measurements exceed 420. Methane concentrations have already surpassed 1,900 parts per million, more than 2.5 times pre-industrial levels. According to the World Meteorological Organization, both indicators continue to rise year over year, which means the system is not stabilizing, it is still moving further away from its safe range. Temperature data reinforces this trajectory. Observations from the Copernicus Climate Change Service show that 2023 reached approximately 1.48 degree above pre-industrial levels, and multiple months in 2024 temporarily exceeded 1.5 degree. This is not just a symbolic threshold. It directly affects atmospheric chemistry. Higher temperatures accelerate photochemical reactions, particularly those responsible for ground level ozone formation, which is one of the most difficult pollutants to control. At the same time, not all pollutants respond in the same way. Over the past 2 decades, Europe has managed to reduce PM 2.5 concentrations by roughly 30% since 2005, largely due to emissions control and cleaner technologies. However, ozone levels have not followed the same trajectory. In several regions, ozone concentrations remain stable or increase during warmer periods, confirming what atmospheric chemistry model predict. Reducing emissions improves some pollutants but does not guarantee overall air quality improvement. This is where scientific projections become critical. Research published in Nature Climate Change and modeling from institutions such as the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research show that under current trajectories, most planetary boundary indicators will continue to deteriorate or remain unstable through at least 2050. Even in mitigation scenarios where emissions decline, the system does not return quickly to safe conditions. There is a built in delay driven by atmospheric processes, ocean heat storage, and land feedbacks. If we break this down into a timeline, the picture becomes more concrete. By 2030, climate models indicate a continued increase in heatwave frequency across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia. These heat waves are directly linked to ozone formation, meaning more frequent episodes of high ozone concentrations during summer periods. In parallel, wildfire seasons are already extending, with scientific projections indicating an increase in burning area of approximately 20 to 30% in several regions within the next decade. By 2050, underwarming scenarios approaching 2 degrees Celsius. Studies show that ozone-related pollution is expected to increase across large parts of Southern Europe, the United States, and China. Wildfire activity in regions such as the Mediterranean and Western North America could increase by up to 30 to 50%, significantly amplifying particulate pollution. At the same time, population exposure remains high. Data from the European Environment Agency shows that even today, over 90% of the urban population in Europe is exposed to pollutant levels above recommended guidelines, at least part of the year, and projections suggest that this exposure will remain significant even with the policy improvement. By 2100, scenario modeling diverges significantly. In strong mitigation pathways, air quality improves but does not fully stabilize across all regions. In higher emission scenarios, the system becomes increasingly unstable, with more frequent extreme pollution events driven by climate interactions rather than direct emissions alone. Real world events already reflect these projections. In South Asia, particularly in cities such as Delhi, PM 2.5 concentrations frequently exceed safe thresholds by several multiples, creating persistent exposure conditions for hundreds of millions of people. This confirms that there is no single global trajectory for air quality. Instead, multiple regional realities are developing simultaneously. There is also an important internal discussions within the scientific community itself. While many models emphasize that mitigation efforts can improve long-term outcomes, other research highlights this growing risk of tipping points, where certain processes become self-reinforcing and harder to reverse. This divergence does not indicate disagreement on the direction of change. but it does reinforce uncertainty in the timing and scale of future outcomes. And this is where the most important shift in understanding happens. The assumption that reducing emissions will directly and quickly improve air quality is no longer fully valid. Scientific evidence shows that even with a reduction, air quality can remain unstable or even deteriorate in certain conditions due to temperature effects, chemical interactions, and large scale environmental events. This is the twist that changes the entire narrative. The system does not respond in a straight line, it responds through interaction. And if you reduce the entire scientific position to one clear forecast, it sounds like this. We are not entering a phase where air steadily improves year by year. We are entering a phase where air quality becomes increasingly variable, regionally uneven, and influenced by processes that extend beyond direct human control. Which means the future of air is no longer defined only by what we emit. It is defined by how a system that is already out of balance behave next. And if we look at how economists approach air, the conversation starts from a completely different place than science. Science looks at limits, economics looks at activity. And the key question is not what the system can sustain, but what the system needs to keep running. Global economic output continues to grow, and with it, energy demand. According to projections from the International Energy Agency, global energy demand is expected to increase by around 20-25% by 2040, even under scenarios that include efficiency improvements. This means that regardless of policy direction, the system requires more energy and not less. And this is where the first constraint appears. Economic systems are built on continuity. Factories, logistics networks, data centers, transport systems. None of them operate on future assumptions. They operate on current availability. If energy is not available, activity stops. And when activity stops, economic output falls immediately. This is why, from economic perspective, energy is not just a sector. It is the foundation. And the priority is not whether energy is clean. The priority is whether it is available and affordable. This explains why, despite long term commitments to decarbonization, investment patterns remain heavily tied to fossil fuels. In 2023, global investment in oil and gas upstream activities reached approximately 528 billion, according to the International Energy Agency. At the same time, renewable investment is growing, but it does not replace existing capacity at the speed required to meet demand. From an economic standpoint, this is not contradictory. It is structural. The system is expanding while trying to transition at the same time. The second dimension is cost. Clean energy is not just a technological problem, it is a capital problem. Transition in energy systems requires massive upfront investments in infrastructure, including generation, storage, and grid expansion. Estimates suggest that achieving global net zero targets would require annual investments exceeding 4 trillion per year by 2030. This raises a fundamental economic question. Who pays? Higher energy costs translate directly into higher production costs, which then affect inflation, competitiveness, and consumer prices. This is particularly sensitive in the industrial sectors such as steel, chemicals, and manufacturing, where energy represents a significant share of total costs. This is why economic policy often slows down or adjusts transition timelines. Not because the direction is rejected, but because the cost of moving too fast becomes economically destabilizing. You can see this clearly in recent years. When energy prices surged in Europe between 2021 and 2022, governments intervened with more than 650 billion in support measures to stabilize households and industry. This was not an environmental policy decision, it was an economic necessity. And it shows how priorities are ranked in practice. Stability comes first. The third dimension is what economists refer to as externalities. Pollution, including air pollution, is a classic example of an externality, meaning its costs are not fully reflected in market prices. Companies pay for fuel, labor, and infrastructure, but the long term health and environmental costs of emissions are often distributed across society rather than included in production costs. In theory, mechanisms like carbon prices are designed to correct this. The European emission trading system has been carbon prices fluctuate between 60 and 100 euro per ton of CO2 in recent years. However, even at these levels, economists argue that pricing does not fully capture the total cost of environmental damage, and this creates a structural gap. The market does not naturally prioritize clean air because the cost of pollution is not immediately visible in financial terms. Another important factor is timing. Economic systems are inherently short term in their decision making. Investment cycles, quarterly reporting, and political cycles all operate on relatively short time horizons. In contrast, the benefits of improved air quality often materialize over much longer periods. This creates what can be described as a delay problem. The cost of transition is immediate, the benefits are delayed. As a result, there is a natural tendency to postpone or slow down decisions, especially during periods of economic uncertainty. This is not necessarily a deliberate choice against environmental improvement. It is a consequence of how economic systems evaluate risk and return. At the same time, there is a growing recognition of environmental risk within financial markets. Large institutional investors, insurers, and asset managers are increasingly incorporating climate and environmental factors into their decision making. ESG frameworks, green bonds, and sustainability linked financing have all expanded significantly over the past decade. However, this shift remains partial. Capital still flows towards sectors that provide stable returns and short term payback. And in many cases, that still includes fossil fuel infrastructure, particularly when energy demand remains high and supply constraints persist. Another critical aspect is inequality. Air pollution is not distributed evenly across economic systems. It tends to concentrate in regions with a high industrial activity, dense populations, and lower regulatory enforcement. This means that the economic benefits of production are often separated from the environmental costs. In practical terms, this creates a global imbalance. Some regions consume cleaner energy while others bear a disproportionate share of pollution. From an economic perspective, this is not accidental. It is a result of how production and supply chains are structured globally. When you combine all of these elements, the economic perspective becomes clear. The system is not designed to optimize for air quality, it is designed to maintain growth, stability, and affordability. Air quality is part of the equation, but it competes with the other priorities, and in many cases, it is ranked lower. And if we look at policy not as declarations, but as actual decisions taken over the past few years, the picture becomes much more precise. Governments have not abandoned environmental goals, but they have clearly begun to adjust how those goals are implemented, especially when it comes to air quality and emissions. At the global level, the Paris Agreement remains the central reference point, with countries committing to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, with efforts toward 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, the gap between commitments and implementation has become more visible. According to UN climate assessments, and current policies still place the world on the trajectory closer to 2.5 2.9 degrees of warming by 2100, which is already reflects a divergence between ambition and execution. In Europe, environmental policy is structured through the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package, targeting at least 55% emission reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. In late 2024, the European Union reached a political agreement to revise the Ambient Air Quality Directive, introducing stricter limits for pollutants such as PM 2.5, moving toward 10 micrograms per cubic meter by 2030, significantly lower than previous standards. At the same time, implementation includes flexibility. Member states can request postponements of up to 10 years under specific conditions, particularly where compliance would require major economic restructuring. This creates a dual effect. Targets become stricter, but timelines become negotiable. The same pattern appears in carbon regulation. The EU emissions trading system has pushed carbon prices into the range of 60 to 100 euros per ton of CO2, increasing pressure on industry. However, free allowances remain in place for energy intensive sectors, and full exposure is being phased in gradually. So, the carbon border adjustment mechanism will only fully apply after 2026, reflecting a deliberate attempt to avoid sudden economic shocks. At the same time, there are clear examples of policy rollback and adjustment. During the energy crisis of 2022, Germany brought coal fired power plants back into operation, and the Netherlands lifted caps on coal utilization. These decisions had immediate consequences. In Germany, the temporary return of coal increased short term emissions and slowed the decline of particulate pollution in certain regions, directly affecting air quality outcomes despite long term climate commitments. In parallel, more than 30 LNG infrastructure projects were accelerated across Europe between 2022 and 2024, effectively locking in fossil fuel capacity for decades. This is the first clear contradiction. Policy tightened environmental targets on paper while simultaneously expanding fossil fuel capacity in practice. At the same time, policy is not uniform even with the same region. Within the European Union, member states are not aligned in how quickly they can move. Countries such as Germany and the Netherlands push for faster transition and stricter standards, while others, including Poland and several Eastern European economies, continue to rely heavily on coal and request more flexible timelines. This creates internal friction. The policy framework is shared, the implementation is not. And as a result, air quality outcomes differ significantly across the region. In the United States, policy shifts are more visible through regulatory changes. Recent actions by the Environmental Protection Agency include both tightening and loosening measures. For example, proposed vehicle emission standards aim to significantly reduce transport emissions by 2032, while at the same time, multiple deregulatory actions have reduced requirements for monitoring, reporting, and compliance in industrial sectors. This dual track approach reflects a broader policy logic. Some sectors are pushed forward, others are given space. Air quality policy is also increasingly shaped by legal pressure. Across Europe, courts have ruled against governments for failing to meet air quality standards. In France, the government was fined for exceeding pollution limits, and in Germany, court decisions forced cities to introduce stricter traffic restrictions, including diesel bans in the urban areas. These measures have shown measurable effects. In cities where diesel restrictions were introduced, nitrogen dioxide levels declined significantly within a few years, demonstrating that targeted policy can produce visible improvements in air quality when applied consistently. At the same time, more than 300 cities across Europe have implemented low emission zones, restricting high polluting vehicles. Some cities, including Paris and Amsterdam, are moving towards zero emission zones in the coming years. But these policies are not frictionless. Public resistance has led to delays and revisions. In several countries, protests against fuel costs, transport restrictions, and environmental measures have forced governments to reconsider timelines and implementation strategies. This introduces a second layer of conflict. Environmental policy is not only shaped by science or economics, it is shaped by public acceptance. There is also a structural mismatch in timing. Political cycles operate over 4 to 5 years, while environmental improvements, particularly in air quality, often take decades to materialize. This creates a gap between decision making and outcomes. Policies are expected to deliver visible results quickly. Air quality does not respond that fast. Geopolitical factors have started to directly influence environmental policy. Energy security has become a dominant priority, and in the United States, oil production has exceeded 13 million barrels per day, while in Europe, diversification of gas supply has taken precedence over rapid decarbonization. These decisions are not framed as environmental rollbacks, but they have direct implications for emissions and air quality. And this is where the core contradiction becomes visible. Policies aimed at improving air quality coexist with decisions that increase emissions in the short term. Not because policymakers are ignoring the problem, but because they are managing multiple risks at the same time. And when we put all of this together, the direction becomes clear. Environmental policy is becoming stricter in its targets, but more flexible in its execution. Governments are tightening standards, but extending timelines. They're promoting clean energy while maintaining fossil fuel capacity. They're introducing regulations while simultaneously adjusting them under economic and political constraints. Policy does not eliminate pollution. It decides how much of it can be tolerated. Air pollution is no longer debated in reports. It is being decided in courts. In the previous blocks, the pattern becomes clear. Science defines the risk. Economics explains why change slows down. Policy adjusts timelines and priorities. But when all of that meets reality, the system is no longer theoretical. It becomes visible, measurable, and contested. And the scale of that exposure is no longer marginal. Global environmental and climate litigation has exceeded 2,500 cases, reflecting a structural shift from discussion to enforcement. This is no longer isolated activity, it is systemic. One of the clearest examples comes from the United Kingdom, where clients took the government to court over repeated breaches of nitrogen dioxide limits. This was not about long term climate ambition, it was about failure to meet legally binding standards. In 2015, the Supreme Court ordered the government to produce a lawful air quality plan. In 2016, the High Court ruled that the revised plan remained insufficient. What this established is critical. Air pollution is not only regulated, it is enforceable. France moved further, turning air quality into direct financial liability. The Conseil d'État imposed fines of 10 million euros, followed by additional penalties because pollution levels in major urban areas remained above legal limits. Environmental failure is no longer abstract. It translates directly into measurable fiscal cost. In South Africa, the issue escalated to constitutional level. In 2022, the High Court ruled that air pollution in the high-veld priority area violated citizens' constitutional rights. Air quality is no longer only environmental objective. It becomes a legal right. In Chile, Quintera Puchuncavi case demonstrated how industrial concentration can turn pollution into a public health crisis. More than 300 people required medical treatment after toxic exposure events in a heavily industrialized coastal zone. The area became internationally recognized as a sacrifice zone, where cumulative emissions exceeded what regulatory frameworks were designed to manage. In the United States, the conflict increasingly appears at project level. In Louisiana, permits for large petrochemical facility were initially overturned due to projected emissions of more than 6,000 tons of pollutants annually, alongside approximately 13 million tons of greenhouse gases per year. But in 2024, that decision was reversed on appeal, allowing project to proceed. This is the uncomfortable reality. Even when legal challenges succeed, they do not always change the outcome. At the same time, these cases are no longer confined within national borders. International non government organizations coordinate litigation strategies across jurisdictions. European courts influence national policy. Climate and air related legal actions are increasingly interconnected. And this is where the economic dimension becomes visible. These are not only environmental conflicts, they directly affect capital. Delayed or cancelled projects represent billions in investment exposure. Legal uncertainty increases financing risk. Insurance models begin to adjust in regions with persistent pollution exposure. The structure of response is also changing. What used to be local protest is now a sequence of exposure, organization, litigation, and policy impact. And that sequence is accelerating. 10 years ago, most air pollution conflicts remained local. Today, they are increasingly coordinated, legally structured, and often supported by international organizations. Local cases are becoming part of a broader system of accountability. And this is where all layers intersect. Science measures the risk, economics sustain the activity, policy manages the trade offs. But people live inside the outcome. This is where the system is tested. Because air pollution becomes politically and legally unstable at the moment when trade offs are no longer abstract. When they are measurable, local, and directly experienced, they are no longer accepted. They are challenged. What follows from all of this is not a theoretical conclusion, it is a practical forecast. Over the next years, air quality will not improve uniformly. In developed regions, air pollution will continue to decline slowly, driven by regulations, legal enforcement, and technological upgrades. But this improvement will be uneven and delayed by infrastructure limits, energy costs, and policy adjustments. In emerging and industrial regions, air quality will remain under pressure due to energy demand, urbanization, and continued reliance on fossil based systems. At the same time, fossil infrastructure built between 2022 and 2024, including LNG capacity and extended coal usage, will remain in operation for decades, locking in emissions beyond short term policy cycles. Legal action will continue to grow. More cases will move from national courts to international frameworks. Governments and companies will face increasingly liability, but this will slow projects and shift investment rather than immediately reduce emissions. Policy will remain mixed. Stricter targets will continue to be announced, but implementation timelines will be extended, adjusted, or partially delayed where economic constraints require it. Air quality will improve in specific locations, but at global level, exposure will remain high. And this is the key point. The system will not deliver clean air everywhere at the same time. It will prioritize where it is possible, affordable, and enforceable.